DevOps are completely different, right? But what happens is that there is a completely different angle, which unfortunately, or as the business guys would say, the technologies guys forget, is that at the end of all of it, a business as such is driven by value and is driven by a constant increase in what they're doing for the means in which they are present in the market, right? Now, when we look at this perspective and we compare what actually used to trickle down between agile and the ops world is, ideally speaking, both these practices should actually help, but what should happen was something like this. And I'm pretty sure if we look at some of these photographs, most of you would be able to correlate with a lot of these memes. And to all my friends who are from the ops side, I'm pretty sure you've been in this stage of your life more than once when talking to a developer. Or something like this would also happen when there is something which can't really be tested unless it is in production, right? Now, the question that the earliest adopters of the DevOps movement started asking themselves was that, well, if we are running into all of those things, then what happens to the business goal, right? Now, each of these teams might be right on their path or right on their part, but then the whole problem is that all of this friction that happens between teams is a big impediment to the business as such, right? So it was turning out to be the same classical problem of local optimizations, and the local optimizations were actually going ahead and hindering the global optimization in one way or the other, which is when the DevOps movement started. So if we have to summarize what is DevOps, we would rather put it in these four simple terms. It is an increased collaboration between operations and development teams. Why do we do this? We do this to have an improved flow of information and feedback, because if you really look at it from a business perspective, it's very important that the development and the ops teams are fine tuned, and it's very important that there is a flow between both of them, so that the situations that I showed you in the memes in previous slide do not really arise, because anytime any of those things happen, it's an impediment for the business more than anything else. This cultural movement also has extreme focus on automation of tools and processes, and we'll get into some bits of that. It's a culture of continuous improvement to quickly learn and adapt. And the fourth point is actually one of the most critical parts of the DevOps movement, because you could implement automation, you could increase collaboration as well, one way or the other. But if the culture of continuous improvement and a culture of learning and adapting through every iteration is not there, it becomes tough to sustain DevOps as a movement. Right. Now let's have a look at the DevOps and software delivery life cycle on how do they both basically correlate, or how do they link. And there again, we'll have to start with a little bit of the historical concept on the agile development and extreme programming practices, which basically made the whole purpose of plan and code into really small iterations. And once team actually got settled into this whole plan and code rhythm, they realized that they have to start building and testing more often than they do, which was something that actually started getting fulfilled by a practice called continuous integration. And then we went ahead and we said that, yeah, I mean, all of this is fine, but if it does not reach production, it's no good for us, which is what started getting covered through the process of continuous delivery. So the steps of release actually is something which started getting added on into the. So there's a question over here about why only feedback flow from ops to dev, why not vice versa. I'll answer that a little later through a practice called amplified feedback loops. We'll explain what the thing is over there. It does not mean feedback from only from ops to dev. It means feedback from anyone who's using the software to the people who are building the software. Right. So let's go ahead with this explaining this slide. Yeah. So I was saying, like, the practice of releasing quite often was something that got introduced with the whole concept of continuous delivery. But the whole problem is that businesses started realizing that there is quite a few things that go beyond a software is released. You still have to take care of whether your users are using it or not. You still have to take care of whether they find it useful or not, and if not, what are the changes that should be done for people to be able to use those softwares properly. So then we started adding two more steps, which is operate and learn. And that's where the whole existence of DevOps as a cultural movement started. While for the purpose of explaining this diagram, I had to take a linear progression. But DevOps as a cultural movement is a cycle that starts from plan to code, to build, to test, to release, to operate, to learn, and goes back again to plan. And that overall is the scope of DevOps in the software delivery life cycle. Right, moving ahead, and when we talk about DevOps, uh, we should rather clarify what it means by dev and what it means by ops. So in the DevOps world or in the DevOps cultural movement, all the people all the people who are involved in developing the software products and services are called devs. So that could be business representatives, customers, product managers, quality assurance, analysts, suppliers, architects. And then when it comes to ops, it includes all people involved in delivering and managing the software products and services. So information security professionals, the system engineers, the administrators, the IT operations engineers, release engineers, the DBAs, the network engineers, the support professionals, the suppliers, all of that is ops in the DevOps world. I hope that answers your question, Srinivasa. Right, and moving on to, well, why are we doing all these things at all, right? So yes, of course, like any other cultural movement, DevOps also has its goals, and the goals are pretty straightforward. What we are doing, or rather why we are doing all of this, is to better align IT responsiveness and capabilities to business needs. Because, well, let's face it. I mean, we are in the century and the times that we are. Businesses move fast, the markets move fast, the conditions in which we are working move fast. For all you know, one little service that you provided and was working pretty well till last week might actually just become obviated because of a disruptive technology somewhere else in the world, right? So what's starting to happen is that typically, if you don't have a cultural movement like DevOps, you really find it tough to be responsive to the pace of business in today's world. The other goals are to produce smaller and more frequent software releases, and that again goes with the simple, it's a principle of common sense. It's easier to move smaller parts than to move bigger parts. Reduce efforts and risks associated with software development, because we all agree, uh, at the back of our minds, development of software has more or less been considered a painful process, right? Because it's not just the engineering, it's all the effort that you take to put it into production and see something worthy out of it is what actually drains a lot of effort. The other parts are, of course, to improve the quality of the code and improve the quality of software deployments. And when we say improve quality of the codes, we're not talking of engineering practices addressed by Agile already. When we say improve quality of code, we mean improving the quality of code by making it more relevant to the context of the business, which actually happens by amplified feedback. The other goals are, of course, the whole concept of reducing costs will always be there. But my personal favorite in all these goals has been instill a culture of communication and collaboration. What Agile essentially did was that it took the waterfall cycle and it took all the different teams in the waterfall cycle and made them into one team. What DevOps is now doing is that it's taking all the people after software development and making them into one team as well. And then, of course, we're doing all of this to improve time to market so that we are able to, deliver to market conditions quickly. Right. And then let's talk about the values of DevOps. Like I said, I'll stick to the abbreviation CAMS. Uh, for some people, it is CAMS, but mostly more or less, if you look at the learning bit, it does come as a part of the culture. Right, and Prakash has a question here. Will the participation of ops team in agile scrum meetings can have some value addition? The short answer is yes, they definitely have a value addition. The long answer is there is a different way of doing it. What is the difference between feedback and amplified feedback? Well, feedback could be something as, yeah, it works good. Amplified feedback would be on, all the problems that people had putting this thing that works good, how many users are using it, how many people are actually finding it valuable. So amplified feedback actually would be through a larger audience, but still filter out to make it more relevant information when that feedback reaches to people. Right. So I'll move ahead to the next slide, and thanks, Amber, for pointing out the question. Um, it's actually important to know also what DevOps is not, because there is a lot of literature on the internet about CAMs. There is a lot of literature on the internet about the goals of DevOps. But what I do see is that a lot of that literature genuinely lacks clarifying in a good manner about what DevOps is not. It's not a title or a role. Let's be very sure about it. And as you go through the presentation, I'm very sure you'll realize that it's not a team. I've heard about people asking us to build a DevOps team. My answer to them is, that's your first step into trouble if you're trying to make a DevOps team of sorts. It's not a tool or a platform or a solution. As a matter of fact, some of the things that we do in DevOps automation can never be done by one single tool. It's literally impossible. It's not only culture, then it's called no ops. And it's not only automation also. It is certainly not developers managing the production environment or ops guys managing, development cycles. And it's certainly not engineering. Uh, I have been a little vocal on this part. I do hear a lot of DevOps engineers, and to be honest, in my 6 years experience of DevOps, I really don't know what they do. I would understand if you call someone a DevOps automation engineer, but something like a DevOps engineer doesn't really exist. Right, and I have a question here. I have read somewhere that lean is also one of the value principles of DevOps. DevOps borrows a lot of things from lean. The three concepts of reducing overburden, reducing inconsistency, and cutting down on waste are actually at the heart of the whole DevOps thinking. I hope that answers your question, Deepak. Right, and I'll more concentrate on the left side of this column in terms of who does it, and you'll find some interesting names. Um, well, all of it actually boils down to Toyota, be it Agile, be it DevOps, it all comes from there. They have been doing it for ages without even really talking about it. But then there are retail giants who've got into DevOps. Uh, there are people in manufacturing. There are people in the financial world that are getting into it, and some of them are really big. Uh, my personal favorite in the manufacturing part, and that is why it finds its name over there, is Lockheed Martin. Um, they produce everything from rockets to spaceships to fighter jets, and it's really mission critical software. It actually has to work at Mach 3 speeds, so it's not easy turning out some of those products. Right. Let's talk about where it applies to. As we think, and the part that we're very sure about is it certainly applies very well to product development, both in the technology or rather IT and the non-IT world. Toyota, for example, makes cars, and Lockheed Martin again makes equipments. They're not writing software. It works very well for software vendors. It works well for large IT services and captive IT units. Then the whole concept of e-commerce and e-tail, if you have a social-based business, mobile commerce and mobile apps. So that pretty much covers most of the hot things in the IT industry today. The places where we've seen, or rather, it doesn't apply that well, is managed services uh, organizations providing infrastructure services and managed service operations. Uh, doesn't really work well in the non-technical business support services. Um, and if you're not making too many changes, by production support, I mean two things. I mean, there is active production support of an application where there are frequent code changes, but then once in a while you have production support of the sort which has minimal enhancements, non-disruptive code changes, and essentially there are no source code changes. So in those cases, it doesn't really work well. Right. So moving ahead on the principles of DevOps, there are just three principles following from the Agile philosophy. We like to keep it short and simple in the DevOps world as well. And I hope it answers some of the questions that people had earlier. The first principle is about flow, which is about improving the flow from dev teams to ops teams. It works on certain principles which are about, you know, uh, not allowing a defect or a known defect to pass down the line. And then some of the examples of improving flow are around the practices as depicted in this diagram of continuous integration. So typically in the DevOps world, uh, a check-in is actually followed by a trigger of events, all of which are automated until that particular source code change that has been made by the software engineer gets converted into working software. And all of that actually happens through an automated process. So that's one of the examples of an improved flow, right? Uh, One of the most important practices in terms of that improved flow is continuous integration. The way I like to put it is fail early and build better. The concept is that if something has to break, it might as well break early enough so that you're able to fix it without too much of overhead. It is the practice of integrating new code to the code base as many times as possible in a day. And I hear this quite often when I go to teams and they really want to get to DevOps, and I say that, right, let's do continuous integration. And they say, well, we cannot do it because the build takes 2 hours in a day. Well, my point is you have to start breaking down your code until your build does not take more than 5 to 10 minutes if you really want to benefit from DevOps. Some of the other practices which help improve the flow is continuous delivery. So the whole cycle of code, build, test, deploy, and feedback, that also helps improve the flow. And this is the point where I'm saying that when we say improve flow and feedback, it does not necessarily start from dev and end at the ops. It's pretty much a cycle. There is nothing linear in the DevOps world. It's always in cycles. So, continuous delivery. It's the methodology that focuses on making sure software is always in a releasable state throughout its life cycle. And this is the second point of confusion in terms of what these two things mean. And I do hear a lot of questions about what's the difference between continuous deployment and continuous delivery. See, the part is you have to realize the difference between a deploy and a release for that, right? A deploy is actually a physical activity of installing a software somewhere. The release is the activity of making it open to the public, you know, through an event which could either be, a particular date or a fixed moment in time. So what we are saying in continuous delivery is that if needed to release a software probably tomorrow, you should be able to do it, right? Continuous deployment and continuous integration are incidental to be able to achieve continuous delivery. So they're not different things. They are things that complement each other. Right. Another word of this concept of or the first principle of flow is systems thinking, where as teams start maturing with the whole DevOps movement, they have this natural question on why do we in fact have different dev and ops teams? Let's make a single product team which handles everything right from the day the source code is written to the time it reaches the production. So that kind of a concept is usually called systems thinking, where you have dedicated product teams for the systems that they deliver, and the entire system is actually managed by one single product team. There is no separate devs and ops organizations in those cases. But yeah, that's a very high state of maturity. There are very few people who actually reach there. And why do we do this for? We do this, to ensure that, see, if you have an increased flow, that is when things start moving quickly, and that is when you get to know about whether it works or not much quicker. And when you start bringing in the ops team earlier into the process, uh, you actually kill a lot of problems. You nip them in the bud even before they existed. Because, a lot of times the problems happen because there is this great wall of confusion between people who build the software and people who manage it. What we're trying to do here is we're trying to obviate that. Moving on to the next slide, and I hope this answers the question about why is there feedback only from dev to ops. Uh, Are you all able to hear me, or is the audio gone for everyone? Am I audible to all of you? I heard the audio is gone. Okay, so might be a local problem. One place. If any of you are still not able to hear, drop a message to Praveen Yadav. He's a participant here, and he'll get in touch with you. Right, so coming back to the second principle, which is about feedback, and someone had the question that why is the feedback only from dev to ops and not the other way around? You can actually look at it here when I say amplified feedback loops. What I mean is that there is a continuous feedback on both sides. There is continuous feedback from ops to dev, and then there is continuous feedback from dev to ops as well. Again, I'll take the same diagram for amplified feedback loops. What I explained last time was that right from the time the developer checks in her code to the time that there is test environments is what we talk about, in terms of flow. Uh, but what happens is, or let me take a pointer here because it will help explain better, right? So this little part here of the developer adding code, and then she doesn't really have to do anything manually, and then you get a deployed environment with that code is essentially a part of flow. What we are saying is that it doesn't even stop there. If she's added some code and it has actually got deployed, it should get tested, and then there is a feedback on her work that reaches back to her and the stakeholders and any other people who might be interested in that change. And in the DevOps world, what we try to do is we try to make as much of it automated as possible, because there is no use waiting to know whether my little change worked or not. If you have a way of ensuring or finding out whether it works or not, you might as well do it right away. And if you're doing it right away, you might as well let people know whether it is working or not. So that's one of the concepts behind improved, or rather amplified feedback loops. Why do we do this? We do this for one very simple and important concept. It's called tribal knowledge. The example I take is that, well, big countries need constitutions and laws and institutions, but if you look at a tribe, they don't really have a constitution. Neither do they have, very verbose departments. But the tribe actually always knows collectively what's the best thing to do for their collective survival. It repeatedly goes and does that without having the need of any processes or documentation of, exchanging information. Imagine a small tribe in the Amazon which had to actually hand over a document from one hunter to the other on how to gather food. I mean, I'm pretty sure they wouldn't have survived, right? So yes, we do this to increase tribal knowledge. And one of the good things with tribal knowledge is that it removes all the overheads of making people up to speed, It removes all the overheads of bringing new people in or even having information in place. Right. I'll move to the next page, which is about the third principle of DevOps. It's called continual experimentation and learning. And you know, the simple example I take always in this part is I hope all of you remember this little man. He's considered to be one of the greatest champions in whatever he did. There is a reason why he's called God, which is by his own admission. If he's played cricket for 100 hours in his life, 90 of those hours he was in the nets. So goes to show what's the importance of practice and learning in anyone's career. Uh, the concept behind continuous learning and improvement is, to give your people some time within their day-to-day job so that they can, get off from what they're working and run these little cycles of practicing new things, new tools, new technologies, or even the same things just to be able to do it better. The other example of how important continual learning is the concept of the improvement kata, which was introduced, taking a little cue from how the Japanese samurai warriors used to live. Now, these are not people who used to fight a war every day, but they would dress up in a particular way, and they would take their sticks and they would practice their their skills every single day as if they are about to go to a war. And that was one of the reasons why they were considered one of the most efficient warriors in the pre-industrial era. So we should take a little cue from all these ancient civilizations and cultures. What it goes to prove beyond doubt is that you have to have a way of continuously learning and adapting. And one of the ways which DevOps utilizes here again, it's nothing new. It's again one of those places where we've just picked the common sense that was always there and started applying it in the DevOps movement. So one of the ways we go ahead with continual experimentation and learning is by employing the PDCA cycle. We keep it down to very simple 5 questions when we have anything to do in the DevOps movement. What is the target condition? What is the actual condition? What stops us from going there? What is the next step that we could do to solve this problem? And when can we go and see what we've learned from this step? And this is pretty much the standard procedure I follow when teams would come and say, "Hey, we want to do DevOps," and I ask them, "So what stops you from doing DevOps?" The answer is, "Yeah, well, we cannot deploy to production daily." What stops you from deploying in production daily? So that's how you get onto that cycle, and then you figure out what's the first step to do uh, to get into a full-fledged DevOps cycle. Has the audio gone down for all of you? I do see some questions. We'll try to answer them uh, in the Q&A session. Why do we do this? It's very important to look at the first point in this slide. We do this so that we can fail often and sometimes intentionally, because it's not possible to learn about whether or how a thing works or does not work unless you get to experiment with it. We sometimes inject faults into our system, and we inject them deliberately so that we can learn how our system will work if there are failures. For example, there is a crazy company called Netflix which came up with a very crazy tool called the Chaos Monkey. What it literally does is it tears down the production environment. Now, for some of you, it might sound as a very scary thing, but they do this in and out to ensure or to find out how resilient their systems are, even if the underlying cloud is broken down. And the advantage of that is there was an there was an Amazon AWS meltdown about 3-4 years ago. Netflix was the only company that was still able to service customers, even when the platform on which they were running was having a meltdown. And yeah, so that's one of the examples. I have a little message over here, and I'm really sorry. The chat window is actually going at a crazy pace, so it looks like a long message from Ajay. And I know, Ajay, you had raised your hand and you had a few other questions as well. In the interest of time, I'll read out some of the important messages which my team is tracking, as we go through this presentation, and we'll try to have a little discussion about it. Right. So from there, I'll move to CAMS now. Those were the three principles. And the first principle in the DevOps world is culture, right? And you might be asking that, we're talking of tools and technologies, and then all of a sudden we get down to culture. The reason we get down to culture is because of one very important reason. Culture impacts business. That's the bottom line. And you can see here, uh, we're just trying to, if I really have to summarize on how culture actually goes ahead and impacts the business, there are symptoms in a low trust culture. Things are procedural, things are painfully slow, changes are woefully expensive. Somehow you just have the only option is to react after all hell has broken loose. But if you compare that with a high trust culture, those cultures tend to be more proactive. They tend to be more open and experimented. They are more empirical in the sense that people don't go by gut feelings. People people go ahead by little experimentations and their results. High trust cultures are agile, and then of course the cost of change is very low. Understanding culture. Uh, what I would rather do is I would skip to the next slide because it makes more relevance. And the best way to understand culture is to realize that culture itself is a complex thing to understand. What you could rather do is you could look at culture as an aggregation of behavior. And if you go down a step further also, you could look at behavior as an aggregation of little habits that people do day in and day out. And then you can understand culture pretty better, right? So, so one of the concepts with DevOps is that while we do say we transform culture, we don't go ahead and change it directly. What we do is we change these little habits that people have day in and day out, which goes ahead and changes behavior, and then that behavior becomes culture. Right. Transforming culture, never an easy task. We've done it sometimes. Sometimes we bleed it. Sometimes the people who are going through bleed it. Uh, so yeah, no one size fits all solution, but more or less this is a framework that we think works well. The first part is look at the historical reasons of why a certain culture exists. It's very important to learn that. Also understand the motivations on why that culture wants a change. And then come the awesome, or rather the obvious steps. The first one of them is, to move low trust to systems, not people. For example, in the first principle of DevOps, I showed you a completely automated continuous delivery pipeline, right? That's an example of moving low trust to system. In that pipeline, at every step of it, we actually go ahead and stress our system, ensuring or going ahead with the concept that none of the code that is coming in is actually supposed to work, right? Having said that, we don't keep the low trust to people. We just leave it to the systems. Bring in small habitual changes one at a time. You can't really change everything in order to start getting into DevOps. You have to wait and change one little thing at a time. Otherwise, it becomes chaos instead of transformation. It's very important to openly discuss failures, but not mistakes. Mistakes do happen sometimes, but what I would also like to say is that not all failures are because of mistakes. We should also encourage smart failures. Smart failures are the ones which people incur when they are allowed to experiment and learn in a controlled environment. Then comes there was a question about uh, DevOps takes in a lot from Lean, right? And in terms of where it takes from Lean, the second last point over here, focus on unplanned work and bottlenecks and remove them as soon as they occur. That's actually a Lean principle. It's nothing new that DevOps has invented. And then the last point, which I'm pretty sure some of you will find controversial, um, do away with heroes. Good teams don't really have a hero. Uh, but we're having this WebEx mostly in India, so I'll take a example of a sport which most of us connect to. The Indian team 10 years ago had a hero, right? But the part is, or the fact is, that there were other teams which did not have a hero and they used to perform much better. See, the problem with heroes is that you can't do anything once that person is gone. So either the hero burns out, which is obvious, and then the team is left dangling, searching for a new hero. But yeah, if you have a team where people can collectively take responsibilities and get things done, then you're not really dependent on any person. Right, now let's talk about the most interesting part of DevOps, right? Automation. The simple reason to explain it would you hire a guy who has these tools if you were looking for a carpenter, or would you hire the guy who has these tools? I don't think none of us would actually even think before deciding whom to hire. And that's one of the problems with software industry as well. We write software to automate business, but the business of writing software is still very manual, right? So yes, automation is important, and it's as important as you trying to do a carpenter's job with 5,000 years old tools manually, or you trying to do it with people who really have better tools and start and get the job done quicker. Talking of the automation space, this is the most humongous space in DevOps. Has a lot of things. So what I'll do is I'll try to break down some of the tools in some particular branches of DevOps. When it comes to the CI and testing world, we have tools like Travis CI, we have Jenkins, we have Bamboo, and that little machine gun on the right corner is a tool called Gatling. What we started doing off late in our consulting assignments is introduce a concept of continuous performance also, When we say continuous integration, we say continuous testing, we realize that nobody talks about continuous performance monitoring. So Gatling is a very good tool for that. What we essentially try to do is bring performance testing into a nightly job instead of having it done once in a release and then figuring out what went wrong. And Gatling, ladies and gentlemen, is a very good tool for that. The other scope of DevOps automation comes under the part of infra as code. Infrastructure as code has a lot of tools as well. I'm just listing a few, the most prominent ones. But yes, be rest assured there are more tools than this. It's an endless space, like I said. But yes, the most common ones are certainly the ones we've listed here. We have Puppet, we have Docker, we have Chef, we have Ansible, and we have Vagrant, which I think is one of the most powerful tools in the space. But unfortunately, it is the least used. The other space of DevOps automation comes in collaboration and monitoring. And the question, and the reason why we need these tools is you people have to ask yourself a question: how many times have you wasted hours between the dev and the QA trying to figure out if a change or a defect had been built or deployed to certain environment or not, right? And that takes away a lot of time, even after your daily scrums. So what we try to do in the DevOps world is we just try to cut down all that confusion. Hence, the tools for collaboration and monitoring are very important. Again, it's a mixture of open source and paid tools. Hygeia is in the open source space pretty much what, Elasticsearch and Logstash and Kibana do in the open source space pretty much what New Relic does. Then you have tools like Slack and HipChat and Trello, which ensures that the teams are always connected. It's called Chat Ops. And then we have tools like Splunk and Hygeia, which give a global continuous delivery monitoring system. You can create as many dashboards as you want for monitoring as many things as you want by using these tools smartly. Right. So I'm moving on from culture to automation to measurement and sharing. And this again is a very different part of DevOps. I see a question here: is there a model to measure the benefits of DevOps implementation? The answer is yes, there is. Uh, but what I would also like to add is that the way we go about creating that model is very different. And the reason I say it's very different is because of this exact slide that's there in all of your systems. See, the concept with measurement in DevOps comes from the thought that the most successful projects have been the ones which have just tracked 4 or 5 metrics, but they've just tracked the 4 or 5 most important ones. They haven't really gone ahead and created complex Excel spreadsheets about how progress should be measured. They've just kept it to 4 or 5 things, and they've stuck to that. Those are the most successful teams when it comes to DevOps implementations. And which is why, yes, there is a model, but the measurement concept of DevOps is pretty much can be defined by this very amazing phrase from Albert Einstein. Not everything that can be counted counts, and not everything that counts can be counted. When we say measurement in DevOps, we say that you measure something only after you have established that it delivers certain value, right? For example, some teams would say we should have a throughput of 100 requests per second. That is a good indication of the performance of our web-based software. What a DevOps organization would say is, let's calibrate an acceptable rate of a throughput. We really don't know if it is 1,000 or 700 or 1,500, but once we calibrate it, make sure that it does not slip by 5%. Now, to be honest, measuring it in the second way is something that will deliver real benefits to you instead of chasing a magic figure of 1,000 requests per second because Google or someone else does that. Another example, and this is the one where I've seen engineering teams take most of the hit when it comes to DevOps. We want to have more than 70% code coverage of tests because that's an industry standard. What DevOps teams do is and just giving an example from one of the programming languages. What they do is they establish what should be covered, right, without necessarily going on a percentage. And once they've established what should be covered, they would rather go and say, let's not slip from this by more than 5 to 10%. That's again a easier thing to manage than coming up with a score of 70% upfront and then trying to maintain it. Right. And then comes the fourth part of it, which is sharing. And the reason why we call sharing is because it really helps you go beyond DevOps to biz DevOps. It really makes everyone one single team, and that's something which hasn't occurred in the IT world, but it has been there in some of the manufacturing companies where everyone from the business to the engineering to the supply chain is actually one team. Right. So that's why sharing matters. You should encourage ceremonies that encourage sharing experiences. It could be about successes, but I would say it should also be about failures. And there are many ways of doing that. There are ways of organizing blogs. You can organize meetups within your company's organizations. You can organize these little events where everyone just sits together, has a coffee together, eats some snacks, and talks about anything which is not related to work. It just helps build bridges between people, and later on, that comfort between people, even if they are from different departments, goes a long way when you have to deliver something critical. Right. So what do we mean by sharing in the DevOps world? Uh, well, I don't mind if someone shares their food with me, but that's not where we're stuck at. What we mean by sharing is shared vision. We mean shared responsibility. So in the DevOps world, the team fails. It's not the case that the team failed and the business stakeholder did not. When I say the team failed, I mean everyone who was involved in the product. If there is a failure, it's the responsibility of everyone right across the chain. They have a shared vision. It's never the case in organizations which have a DevOps culture. You'll never find you know someone telling something and the other one doing it. It doesn't work like that. You really have to get into a common vision. You have to share and explain it into people, and then they go ahead and get the work done better. It also means shared knowledge, which means again that yeah, there are not these few people with five-star badges who know everything. The point is that sooner or later, all the knowledge that is there should be spread amongst everyone. Um, One of the time-tested tools for creating this shared vision is value stream mapping. I'm sure a lot of people must have heard about it. The concept is simple. Between the idea to product, or between the raw material to the end customer, do a map, see what are the activities that come into picture, and then see where are you wasting time because of inconsistency or overburden, and then just try to remove it one step at a time. Um, Moving on to the next slide, again an example of shared responsibility, I would say is again, this is also an example of measurement in the DevOps world. I like to use the term transversal monitoring. Without getting too much into the details of the dashboard, it does not just monitor traffic or CPU usage. It also monitors how many tests are running and how many of them are failing. It also monitors what's the health and status of every environment. It also monitors how many of these how many of these features are being actively used in production and how many are not. All of that information in one little dashboard. That's an example of both measurement in the DevOps world and shared responsibility. An example of shared knowledge is intuitive reports. The point that I would try to make over there is that if you cannot convey the message by simple color codes, there is something really wrong with that dashboard or the report that you have. In the DevOps world, we keep the report simple, but we make sure that a mere color coding is enough. So for example, if you look at this, sorry, if you look at this little chart over here, you don't need too much to be explained. You would basically realize that yeah, what's happening is that there's a huge amount of failures in the test that we're supposed to run. And then you can see over here also about, what are the features going through. So, out of all the features, I can see close to half or maybe close to one-third of them are not working. So, the reports have to be as intuitive as that. Because to be honest, if someone has to read through your document for 5 minutes or 10 minutes and still have questions about what's going on in the project, then that's not a good report. So what I would rather do is I would keep a report which is at the max 2 pages of PDF. It has about it has about 6 to 7 diagrams. But if you go through those 6 to 7 diagrams, you get a very good picture of what's the progress. Nothing more than that. Right, talking about DevOps tool chains. The point I would like to make here is that uh, there is no single tool that does DevOps. So DevOps actually relies on a tool chain. It does not rely on a single tool. I would also recommend to all the organizations who are trying to practice DevOps is give up the habit of expecting a single vendor or a single tool to solve this DevOps automation for you. And as it was rightly said in Fight Club, the first rule of DevOps Club is to continuously deploy to production. So if you really want to implement a DevOps tool chain, that's how you have to start. Ask yourselves the question on how can we continuously deploy into production. That gives you a way of implementing the tool chain because it forces you to draw your delivery pipeline for the first time. You then start mapping tools from left to right, and then you see if the flow from dev to ops improves from integrating a tool from one to the intermediate right. If you find a tool that cannot really integrate with other tools, throw it out of the picture, get a new one. Keep it simple. You don't really have to complicate things over here. Look at one step at a time, automate it, then look at how it can fit into the entire cycle. Then go ahead and automate the next step. And once you're done, you repeat this process from right to left as well. That's when you get a DevOps tool chain, which actually is giving you a complete cycle. Right. So let's also throw in a little word about the do's and don'ts of when you're transforming to DevOps. The do's are always create cross-functional teams. It should be represented by everyone from the business to the dev to the ops. Let the team decide what works. I've seen quite often. I've seen tools being decided and frameworks being decided in closed door meetings, and then teams having to survive with them, whether it made sense for them or not. That does not help. Sooner or later, it's going to run you into more trouble than the things that it solves. Give room for controlled experimentations and, more importantly, failures in those controlled experimentations. And then the most important part is to co-create, co-launch, co-learn, and repeat. There are some don'ts as well. Do not think about DevOps transformation as an automation project. You'll not really achieve much. Uh, do not ever create a DevOps team. To be honest, if you really reflect on what all I've talked about, there is no one single team that can do this for others. DevOps, again, like Agile, is a state. It's about being DevOps instead of one team doing DevOps for others. Develop in isolations. I've seen that problem come quite often, where the ops team goes ahead and implements an infrastructure automation solution in isolation, and none of the Scrum teams ever use it. Create bloated processes for the sake of documentation. See, the point is, when you're going through DevOps transformation, you will be creating something, and then through smaller cycles, you will be changing them again and again through iteration. So, unless you reach a stable state where the changes across iterations are reduced, it does not really make sense to fix things in documentation. So that's a bit about the do's and don'ts of DevOps transformation. And that brings us to the end of the presentation. You can see, I'm a real DevOps guy. I've just taken all the DevOps things from all over the places and put it here. But yeah, the references are some very good material to learn more about DevOps. You can follow us on the Twitter handles mentioned over here, and we'll quickly get down to questions over here. Leave this to Amber. Sorry. So there was a question by Ajay. Is this the only way that there should be only one team taking care of development and operations for implementation of DevOps? Can't they be separate teams, specialists? Uh, see, when you do that, what you're essentially doing is, to answer this, I would say we also need to realize why Agile got the better over Waterfall. The problem with Waterfall was that there was local optimization in teams of each of the stages of Waterfall, right? What we did in Agile was we brought everyone together, the dev, the QA, the business analyst, the architecture guy, everyone together, and which is why those teams were able to deliver. So we're doing the same thing in the DevOps world. When we're saying is that if you've done those things in your development part, I mean, what stops you from taking the people who are supposed to manage the software as part of this product team as well? It increases collaboration. It reduces the whole concept of localized optimization. The dev team might be doing some localized optimizations, and the ops team might be doing something themselves. But on the overall basis, because they're not talking to each other, those efforts are not coordinated. So that is why I say it's always better to have one single team. Gagandeep Singh had a question. Isn't A in the PDCA? Okay. 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 Yeah, well, I mean, you have varying acronyms around these things. Depends on different places where we come from. But yeah, I've also seen ACT, and also seen ADAPT in places. In the DevOps world, we prefer using the word ADAPT because that actually gives you the room of understanding what has to be done next. The reason is that ACT also sounds a repetition of do, which is why we try to avoid it. Okay, and then there is a very project-specific question, so we'll get back to you on that, Gagan, a little later. We have a question about DevOps in a waterfall culture. Yes, of course. I mean, if you have waterfall culture, I'm pretty sure you would definitely find advantages of DevOps. But the point is, once you start doing DevOps, or once you start becoming a part of the DevOps movement, that waterfall culture won't really exist, because we slowly go ahead and we transform from waterfall to DevOps. I hope that's what you meant. Is DevOps something that can be introduced in a firm which has waterfall culture or not? Is there a model to measure benefits of DevOps implementation? I usually like to keep it down to two metrics, rather three metrics. The mean time to delivery between an idea that a user gave and he was able to use it in his production. How much was the time spent? That's the first metric. The second metric is every day when people walk into your office, how happy they are. The third metric is every day when your business guys walk into the office, how happy they are looking at the progress of things. So I mean those three are the most powerful metrics to actually measure the success of DevOps. All right. See, I wouldn't go with measuring unit test coverage and code coverage improvement, or defect leakage for that matter, because those are the things which should be taken care of in the continuous integration cycle. DevOps is actually beyond that. If you look at the first principle of DevOps, we say that we do not let a known fault trickle down in the in the pipeline. So the downstream event should never get a known fault. Now, if that's the first principle, then that would mean that I mean, defect leakage should not really be a metric that has to be measured for success. Another way of putting it as a practice, and quite a few mature DevOps teams do that. They follow what they call a zero defect policy, which literally means that they do not proceed unless the defect that they found in this environment has been fixed. But yes, time to production is a very good metrics to measure DevOps success. So is your user feedback on how satisfied users are. So is the whole concept of how much are you spending for getting that thing onto production and usable for your users. The problem is, and there's a comment about if people don't improve their silos, DevOps won't work. See, the concept is that silos uh, have never really worked. If you really look at successful companies, those are the companies that have never worked in silos. I can take the example of JP Morgan. It's a financial institution and big. And what I heard is, not sure of the offices here, but what I heard is some of the offices in the US, everyone sits in like a one single flat hall and works together. I could give you another example of why silos are not good. Uh, there are small companies uh, which do not really have separate marketing and IT departments are the ones which are eating into the big business of established payment banks in the UK and France and the US. These are companies who, even if they are in the financial domain, are companies who do not have departments. They just have product teams. And their product teams actually include people from marketing and sales and production support and operations. So the point I'm trying to make is that if there is one thing that DevOps is about, it is about breaking the silos completely and making people work together. That's one of the most crucial aspects of DevOps. Right. So with that, I would hand it over to Amber for the closing moments of this webinar. And thank you all for your time and patience.
Good evening. Thank you, Anadi, for a wonderful session. I see quite a bit of good comments flowing in on the chat box for participants too. Thank you for your time, patience for the extended time, given that we had a little bit of audio glitch in the opening part of the session. For those of you if you're interested to know, we will be QAI Agility Roots would be launching DOI certification programs, both the foundation as well as the service manager certification programs. Anadi is one of the two accredited trainers in India for DevOps Institute, um, REP. You can watch QAI Agile website and even the mailers. Many of you registered for this webinar through our mailer program reaching you. So the same mailer programs will be reaching you soon. You could take advantage of the early bird and registering. This is almost the first time DOI certified programs are being launched in India. So you can take the advantage of the first movers club for participating and certifying yourself as DevOps Foundation or DevOps Service Manager. Of course, Service Manager is a next level progression after completing Foundation. So we would be keen for participants, all of you out there who are interested in DevOps, to continue interacting with us. We'll be creating a short link for the registered users of this webinar to access a recorded version of this webinar and also post further questions which Anadi, our faculty and trainer, could answer from time to time and populate on the website. Once again, thank you. We are 15, 17 minutes over time, given the few minutes lost in the beginning of the session. Thank you again, each and every one, and hope to see you around for more of these webinars and sessions from QAI coming to you pretty soon.